Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 171, Digesting Judaism. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And as we continue our Omer exploration now into week 5, our guest today is Rachel Gross. She is an assistant professor and the John and Marcia Goldman Professor of American Jewish Studies in the Department of Jewish Studies at San Francisco State University. She is an expert in food, material culture, pop culture. She teaches courses that include Food Fights, The Politics of American Jewish Consumption, 1654 to the Present, and American Jews and Popular Culture. To give you a flavor, so to speak, of what Rachel Gross is interested in, let me tell you a few of her article titles. A Slippery Slope, Jews, Schmaltz, and Crisco in the Age of Industrial Food. Dreidel Salad, The Serious Business of Jewish Food and Fun in Post-War America. And An Unjustified Schmear Campaign, Narratives of American Jewish Food. When we think about the various elements of Judaism, we often think of Jewish food, but when we think about something like Shavuot coming up, the Omer, where we're considering all kinds of elements of Judaism that it's important to put all together, I don't think that we typically think of food as one of those that should be part of that conversation, and yet it probably should be. So we're really excited to jump into this conversation. Rachel Gross, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So this series is taking place as part of our countdown between Passover and the holiday of Shavuot, this 7-week period called the Omer. And really our podcast is always about this, but in this Omer period every year, we're trying to double down, make it extra much about this, where we sort of see the holiday of Shavuot as this time where we kind of reenact the moment at Sinai where Moses received the Torah. And, we're trying to make that a sense, which I think also the rabbis did, that every year in some way we receive the Torah again. But in our time, that receiving potentially has more of a valence of reimagining. And what we're trying to do in these 7 weeks is give people a set of ideas that perhaps they haven't been exposed to before, or they've been exposed to and hadn't thought about as, quote, the Torah, and allowing them to add that into their hopper and to mix it up and to hopefully spend the time on Shavuot trying to put it all together and taking their sense of what Judaism is to one more level further. And so we wanted to talk to you because the material that you talk about, material culture, food, popular culture, it doesn't tend to be the stuff that people imagine when they say, hey, we're going to reshape Judaism. They're thinking about texts and religious rituals and prayers. And I'd love to start by asking you to help us get inside of that a little bit and to understand how that sense of Judaism as a collection of texts and prayers and rituals is insufficient. It doesn't really tell the whole story.
When I teach Intro to Jewish Studies, where some of my students are Jewish and some of them aren't, and I always tell them, for the purposes of our class, Judaism is what Jews do. And for my research as a scholar, I'm interested in what is it that Jews do. For me, that's Judaism. And when I think about, I'm a scholar of religious studies, so I ask questions about what religion is. And when I think about religion as a series of relationships. There's a religious studies scholar, Robert Orsi, who thinks about religion as a series of 3 types of relationships between humans and the divine, humans and the dead, and among humans who are living. And I think it can be any of those 3 types of relationships or some combination of one or more of those types of relationships. So I'm interested in what is it Jews do and what is it that they do in those relationships.
And so when we think about, let's say, for example, food, I think that one of the struggles is food something that we should take seriously as part of what it means to be Jewish, or is food kind of it's something that happens. I mean, we all need to eat, and this or that culture might have food that's a little bit more unique to their culture versus another culture. But how can we sort of think about food on the same plane as the Book of Exodus? How do we kind of think in terms, both in the scholarly terms, but also in practical terms about, it's not necessarily that this thing that you thought was the most important part of Judaism is actually the most important part of Judaism. And this thing that you thought was kind of a side issue actually is way more important than you thought.
So I'm really interested in the ways that Jews build their Judaism. What is it they're doing on the ground? And we're all physical beings. So we live in a physical world, and the physical stuff that we use is always really important. And that includes food. I'm a scholar of material culture, which means stuff. I always say if academics can use two words instead of one, they're going to do it. So material culture is just the study of stuff. And my teacher, Vanessa Oakes, a professor at the University of Virginia, who was my undergraduate mentor, says in her book, Inventing Jewish Ritual, that for Judaism, the material is so important. That doesn't mean it's more important than texts or theology or anything else that we might traditionally think of when we talk about Judaism, but it's at least as important. What is it that people are really doing? And what are the ways that they're forming meaning without necessarily even thinking about it? And food definitely falls into that category. I teach classes on American Jewish food history, and I always begin those classes by telling my students, food is probably the world's most important subject. Now you're all thinking about food because we're here to talk about it, and now all of our listeners are thinking about food because we're talking about it, but even if we weren't talking about it, most of us are thinking about food most of the time. And it's the way we build our worlds, right? The foods we eat and the foods we don't eat, the foods we like and the foods we don't like, not only say something about us personally, but they say something about who our families are and who where our neighborhoods are and what our communities are and how we think about ourselves and our histories and our futures.
I want to build on this Book of Exodus versus the food on our dinner tables piece that Dan brought up, because you could just float by that, but the Book of Exodus has a bunch of food, and the Exodus narrative has a bunch of, in our minds, we think of holy texts and we think of all this stuff, and we're like, yes, we've got 10 Commandments, Revelation. We've also got this paradigmatic food, matzah, that has a super important role in the story, and symbolically for the hastiness with which they had to leave the desert, et cetera, et cetera. And then also, once we keep going with the Exodus narrative into further books, we have manna, we have food coming from heaven. We've got all of these different interesting things related to food. So I think even when we look at the most obviously stereotypically Jewish stuff, like texts, there we are with stuff again. We find these food ways. But I wanted to hone in on that even more because you've done deep thinking on matzo ball soup, on this beautiful, much later version of that very ancient food, matzah, and you've looked at it in a very deep way. And I wanted to name that because I find that so many people, when they're talking dismissively about food Judaism, because there's this whole thing where people, when they want to demean folks who they think don't practice deep Judaism, they say, they're just bagels and lox Jews, or they're just matzo ball soup Jews. And you have this very deep, beautifully historical packet on a bunch of matzo ball soup materials. And it's to me, the proof text, next time somebody says, they're just a matzo ball soup Jew, okay, let's say yes to that. And here's a whole packet of why that's actually a very deep way to be a Jew. So I wanted to hear from you, what can we learn from the kind of role that matzo ball soup plays for a lot of us in our lives?
I want to say about matzah, I love Jonathan Sarna's article on how matzah became square, because most of us, when we think about matzah and think about the most traditional matzah we can imagine, think about a square matzah, which is an invention maybe of the late 19th century, really of the early 20th century, when the Manischewitz company perfected the machinery that would manufacture matzah, as opposed to having handmade and round matzah. I think about matzah ball soup, and I go around deepening people's understandings of matzah ball soup. Matzah ball soup used to be just a Passover food because Jews, like many people, have a tradition of soup dumplings, and matzah ball dumplings would be your soup dumplings for Passover. The rest of the year, why would you make dumplings out of matzah meal? You would make them out of, they'd be kreplach or whatever, depending on where you were in the world. The Manischewitz company, which had perfected machine-made matzah, then branched out to other Passover-related products, and eventually beyond Passover as well. But they started selling matzah meal for Passover, and then they were very good marketers. They've always been very good marketers of their products. And they had the brilliant idea that one could sell matzah meal year-round if you only convinced Jews that matzah balls were a year-round food. So thanks to the Manischewitz company, many Jews do indeed eat matzah ball soup year-round. But thank you to our the corporate sponsors of American Judaism who have really shaped the way American Jews practice Judaism. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I'm really interested in what are religious institutions of American Judaism that we don't necessarily think of as religious institutions. So what happens if we take something like the Manischewitz Company and say this is an institution that has shaped American Judaism? Maybe we look at it kind of neutrally. Maybe it's not necessarily a bad thing. But what are these institutions that have been shaping us and that we have been shaping? But what's interesting, if we take something like matzah ball soup, a lot of your listeners will have strong feelings about matzah ball soup because they had it made by their mother and made by their grandmother, or they remember going to their favorite deli and having matzah ball soup. So it has all of those feelings. And I'm working on a book about American Jews and nostalgia. I think it's been a really powerful force in American Jews' lives. Not necessarily a negative one, but a really one that's really shaped how American Jews think about communal histories and their family histories, and think about their lives in the present, and think about where they want American Jewish communities to go. And when I'm talking about American Jewish nostalgia, I'm talking, of course, about an Ashkenazi nostalgia. I'm talking about the nostalgia that American Jews have for Ashkenazi immigration to the United States from the 1880s to 1923, when Congress cuts off immigration, and images of Eastern European life that get blended together with those images of Ashkenazi immigrants to the U.S. in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
So let me ask you about nostalgia, because I of course agree with your description of the power of nostalgia. And my question about nostalgia, I think that there's actually two levels at which nostalgia works, right? One is the nostalgia for an imagined past that might have been actually true, might not have been, but it almost doesn't matter because the nostalgia is actually for something that we think was true 100, 200 years ago. And then there's nostalgia for the way I grew up with it. And I think that both have their virtues and their problematics. The nostalgia that I find more problematic, not in the sense that it's bad, but in the sense that it kind of doesn't work, is that when I'm nostalgic for some way that I grew up in my home with my parents, and I try to pass that on to my children, unless I've really done the exact same thing in my home such that they're going to be nostalgic for it, which I think often doesn't quite happen, or you don't realize that you're not. You think you're doing it, but you're not really doing it. And so then your Judaism is constructed out of this nostalgia for your parents' form of Judaism or the neighborhood in which you grew up. And you kind of can't understand why your kids aren't being Jewish that way. And it's because fundamentally they don't have the same nostalgia. And so like what troubles me is, and by the way, I think that this comes across in a lot of even the demographic studies that are done by Jewish demographers who grew up in Brooklyn in the 1950s, who have a very powerful sense of nostalgia for a certain way in which they experienced Judaism, which was actually an innovation. It wasn't the way that their parents or grandparents had experienced Judaism. It's actually the way that one generation experienced Judaism, but because that generation grew up and took a central role in evaluating how Jewish people are, it became this kind of touchstone. And then they were very upset and disappointed when people weren't Jewish that way, even though there was nothing necessarily superior about that way of being Jewish. So I'm curious whether nostalgia, or how nostalgia works, not only in Judaism, but also, elsewhere in other religions, how nostalgia works as a way of, as a deep component of a religion or a culture, or whether it's actually sort of a problem.
So first of all, it's useful to define nostalgia. I think of nostalgia as a sentimental longing for a past that cannot be recovered. So when I think about American Jews and nostalgia, I am not just thinking about people's personal nostalgias for their past. Some scholars of nostalgia say that nostalgia can only ever be a personal thing. I can only be nostalgic for my childhood. But I think that American Jews actually teach a certain kind of nostalgia. We teach a kind of nostalgia for Ashkenazi heritage, both in Europe and then the way that Ashkenazi heritage is brought to the United States. And we teach it through a variety of institutions that are not traditionally thought of as religious, but that I think are performing a religious role. So I think about, for examples, I think about Jewish genealogists and the societies that they form, the genealogical societies they form on the local and national level. I look at historic synagogues that are used as museums in the United States. I look at children's books and dolls, the publishing industry around them, including PJ Library, which distributes free books with Jewish content to Jewish and interfaith families in the US and around the world. And I look at delis, especially the artisanal deli revival. I think in a lot of these ways, actually, nostalgia can be forward thinking. In some of these examples, none of these examples are Jews who are looking at replicating the lives of Jews in previous eras. They're looking at a relationship to the past, and they're looking at how it can be relevant to their own lives. So I think nostalgia is about that emotional connection that we have with the past, which is not necessarily saying that Judaism can't be changed. In fact, it is. But what does it mean to have an emotional relationship with the past and to make that past relevant for our own lives?
So I have a question about food again. I just can't get my mind off of food. Sorry, listeners, you're going to be hungry after this episode. So on the food front, okay, so I have been thinking about how like Jewish space works, the idea of Jewish space. And I know that's something that you that you work on, is sort of Jewish spaces that are a little bit off the beaten path from what we think of like a synagogue or a JCC kind of space. But I'm curious in particular about like restaurant spaces. So I live in Providence, Rhode Island, and if you ask people to list off the Jewish spaces, quote unquote, in town, I think they'd name the synagogues, they'd name the Jewish Alliance, which is our sort of combined Federation and JCC building. I don't think they'd name Seven Stars Bakery, which I think is arguably a Jewish space. It's a bakery, just like it sounds, and it's sort of known to the Jews in town as a place where Jews are found. There's lots of people who aren't Jewish who go there. It's just a general bakery and coffee shop, etc. And I don't think it's kosher certified. I think they have like bacon, etc. in their menu. But I wanted to bring that up because I am curious in how you think about Jewish space, and to the extent that you've got thoughts on the restaurant front in particular, on Jewish spaces that manifest around food. I'd be curious to hear from you, like, what is a Jewish restaurant, for example, and have you done any work to look at particularly interesting Jewish restaurants?
Jewish restaurants are a really important place where Jews think about who they are and articulate that both to themselves and to non-Jews. So when I say Jewish restaurant, of course, I don't just mean a kosher restaurant. I don't just mean a restaurant that has a Jewish star on it, but I mean a bagel bakery. I mean a deli, a Jewish deli. These are places where Jews say, this is our food, which we can unpack in a lot of different ways, what counts as Jewish food. But delis, I think, are a particularly interesting case. There's things to be said about bagel bakeries as well. But delis are an interesting place because we think about Jewish history in those spaces. I live in San Francisco, and one of the places I study is Saul's Deli in Berkeley, California. And Karen Edelman and Peter Levitt, the owner of Saul's Deli in Berkeley, California, think a lot about the history that they're telling in that space. And Karen Edelman told me, the story we're telling in this space is that Jews came from Central and Eastern Europe to New York, where they more fully developed the deli, and then they kept going west until they hit Berkeley, California, where they developed this deli. And Saul's thinks really carefully about where they're sourcing their produce and where they're sourcing their meat. It's a very Berkeley kind of deli, and follows a lot of new food trends that are happening here in Northern California and throughout the country. And I love that she's telling this story in part because she's thinking deeply about the history and the heritage she's communicating when she serves her food. But I also love it because in her telling, Berkeley is the center, is like the apotheosis of American Judaism. And she's not wrong for her customers who are experiencing that telling when they're in Berkeley, California. At that moment, of course, it makes sense to tell Jewish history as culminating in their experience of eating a sustainably raised pastrami sandwich, which isn't kosher, but thinks about Jewish history, or the owners think about Jewish history in a particular way.
Now, I don't know if this is a good example, but it's also getting me to think of what I think is actually sort of one of the high points of American Jewish history, which was Elena Kagan's swearing in as the Supreme Court Justice, where, not that she was sworn in, I mean, wonderful that a Jew was sworn in, but it's more a moment that happened when Lindsey Graham asked her where she was on a particular Christmas Eve, because there was something that had happened in the news that day, and he was trying to she was the Solicitor General, I think, and they were trying to peg down where she was when this thing happened. And what she said was, I guess I must have been at a Chinese restaurant along with all of my fellow Jews, because that's what we do on Christmas Eve. And I remember at the time people reacting to that, saying, of course it was funny, but that's not a Jewish thing that she wasn't practicing Judaism. And I think that Lindsey Graham actually erroneously said something about, oh, that's what you were doing for Hanukkah, right? Meaning that he was thinking that somehow Christmas and Hanukkah is the same thing. But what was really going on, at least in my reading of it, was that there is a new Jewish holiday being born, which is the Jewish holiday of Christmas. It has nothing to do with the Christian holiday of Christmas other than being on the same day. But it is a set of new practices and traditions, including going to a Chinese restaurant, that actually is a new Jewish food tradition. And I'd love it if you could sort of put a little bit of a theory onto this, or feel free to completely disagree. But it felt to me like there's something sort of like, what's the difference between that and what I recently learned from our fellow podcast, the Adventures in Jewish Studies podcast from the Association for Jewish Studies, where I learned on that podcast that lox, which I think of as the most Jewish of foods, is actually almost by definition was not a Jewish food when the Jews came over to America, because nobody could possibly afford to have a salmon back in Eastern Europe. So again, there was no way that that was a Jewish food. In fact, the reason why the Jews made lox such a central part of their lives was specifically because it wasn't a Jewish food, and they felt so great that they could now afford it here in America. So they basically took a Scandinavian food and they all flocked to it, very similar, I think, to the way that Jews flock to Chinese restaurants. So it's like, if lox is now a Jewish food, then why isn't Chinese food a Jewish food? So it's like something is there that I feel like people are just conditioned so much to not think about Judaism that way. And I'd love to hear your take on it.
I absolutely think that we can think about Jewish traditions on Christmas as a Jewish activity. Jews often go to the movie theater and go to Chinese restaurants on Christmas as Jews. And when they do so, they go with their Jewish friends and with their Jewish families. And they think about Jews throughout the country who are doing that exact same thing. They feel connected to Jews, other living Jews who they don't necessarily know. They're connected to the decades past of Jews who have done that. For me, that's absolutely religion, right? That's a connection to other living Jews. That's a connection to Jews in the past, an imagination of Jews in the future who will do this activity as Jews. We're forming community by doing that. We're forming meaning, articulating what it means to be an American Jew on this day. Absolutely, that's religion. I don't know how it could be more religious than going to a Chinese restaurant on Christmas. In terms of lox as a Jewish food, of course lox is a Jewish food, right? We eat it and we think about it as a Jewish food. We think about the communities of Jews who ritually have lox, both at, say, Kiddush after, as the meal after synagogue services. We think about it at ritual activities like a bris after a circumcision. It's a particular Ashkenazi American food. And to say that it has a Scandinavian past doesn't negate its Jewishness for us. I happen to think that we need to be wary of food essentialism. Your listeners might be familiar with the idea of gender essentialism, which Judith Butler, the scholar Judith Butler, brings us.
Shout out to listeners. Check out Rachel Adler's episode for more on that.
But when we search for the essence of womankind or the essence of mankind, we're doing a disservice to all of the multiplicities of gendered experiences. And I think that there's such a thing as food essentialism. To think that lox is only a Jewish food, or to think that its Jewishness might be negated by its Scandinavian history, reduces the idea of lox to that one particular history. And we can reduces its ownership to one particular group. And I think that's really troubling. I think when we think about that, we set up national boundaries, actually, and religious boundaries, more to the point, for this podcast. The idea of cuisine was brought to us, was literally invented by French nationalism as a way to think about, as a way to physically define what it meant to be French. And American Jews in particular also define themselves, like many other peoples, define themselves through who we are. And we think about who we are through the boundaries of Ashkenazi food. When we think about who owns lox, we might think carefully about what kind of boundaries, what kind of religious and Jewish national boundaries we're setting up when we do that.
I want to keep rolling with this and sort of look at the inverse, or it's sort of an inverse. I'll curious your thoughts, but I want to think about what we think of as paradigmatically un-Jewish food, and how we essentialize in that way. And I know that you were connected to the Treifa banquet in San Francisco a while back, and so there's like that particular to the Treifa Banquet 2.0, this interesting event that happened a little while back in the Bay Area. But I think that we've got this set of challenges where I mean, I'll talk about myself. I won't try to generalize too much. But like, I grew up, and my Jewish grandmother, who I associated with Jewishness and with Judaism in all sorts of ways, made me peanut butter and bacon sandwiches. That was like, if you asked me what my grandma makes me for lunch when I go and visit her, I would have said, like, this wasn't every day, obviously, but I would have said peanut butter and bacon sandwiches. And that was something that for me, and here I am talking as a vegetarian, and also even before I was a vegetarian, as somebody who had given up eating bacon. So people talk about it as just obviously, straightforwardly, the second something is from a pig, it's like not a Jewish food. And it's based on a set of assumptions about who defines Judaism and what institutions or texts or histories define Judaism that I think, once again, we should question from this, like, what Jews are actually doing lens that you're bringing up. So I'm curious, when we look at the realm of things that we mark in our minds as specifically un-Jewish, what that can teach us about this map of issues as well.
Absolutely. What we don't eat is as important as what we do eat when we think about ourselves. And of course, Jews have a long history of being attracted to, as well as repelled by pork, which has become the paradigmatic non-kosher and therefore non-Jewish food. But Jews do have a relationship with it, right? To negate something or to reject something is to have a relationship with it. If you're not eating it, you still have a Jewish relationship with pork. If you are eating it as a Jew, you often have this whole history of the Jewish relationship with pork in mind, and you are eating it as a Jew. Jonathan Brumberg Krauss specifically discusses Jews' relationship with pork and with other non-kosher foods in his new book, Gastronomic Judaism as Culinary Midrash. And he also does within that chapter, he does a great job of placing the Treifa Banquet 2.0 in historical context. So of course, we can think about pork as Jewish food. When I teach my classes on American Jewish food, I spend a lot of time asking my students a very silly question, which is, what is Jewish food? Thinking about pork and thinking about gefilte fish, thinking about bagels, and asking them each time, is this a Jewish food? We spend time thinking about the Settlement Cookbook, which his religious studies scholar Nora Rubel writes about really wonderfully. And it has a lot of non-kosher recipes, especially in the early iterations of the book, and as well as some of the later iterations. So I spent time asking my students, is this a Jewish cookbook? What does it mean to call this a Jewish cookbook? And our best discussions always happen when we have somebody who says, absolutely, this is a Jewish cookbook. This was made by and for Jews. And we have somebody who says, but it's not kosher. It doesn't engage ideas of Jewish culinary tradition. So I find the conversation often more productive, more useful maybe than the question.
Before we move off the question of food, I want to, I'm reflecting on this, on the Treifa Banquet 2.0 and some of the reactions that we got when we posted something about it. We did a whole long series on God with all kinds of different thinkers about God and atheists and all kinds of things like that. And nobody really was troubled at all. We did a long series on Israel that I was kind of afraid to do with all kinds of different voices. And, everybody was kind of pretty respectful about listening to the various perspectives. When we posted something about the Treifa Banquet on Facebook, we got some of the most really upset kind of comments, people saying, what is this? This is not kosher. Why are they doing this? They shouldn't have done it. It's not that they have to keep kosher, but why should they be telling people about it and all that kind of thing? And I was wondering what the genesis of those comments were. Is it something really about food, that it's literally visceral, that actually food, positive or negative, just provokes these deep reactions from people because it's something about food? Or is it something about Judaism that is so deeply associated with keeping kosher for some reason that everybody, is basically okay with people not keeping kosher, but they shouldn't talk about it?
Yeah, studying food and Jews is really interesting because on the one hand, people are convinced it's frivolous and don't take it very seriously. And on the other hand, it does provoke this kind of vitriolic reaction. So obviously it is important. It's not fluffy. It's something we need to take really seriously. Part of the reaction to the Treifa banquet, I think, as I wrote in a JTA piece at the time, was a misunderstanding in the public reaction about what the event was. The event was a private event that Alex Wall had organized to provide Jews who work in the food industry and make their living selling non-kosher food. She'd provided an opportunity for them to think deeply about what that meant. And for chefs to think deeply and creatively about their work meant to produce food. And that was a really creative and thoughtful expression for them. And I was there as a historian giving a talk about what it meant for Jews to eat non-kosher food. I gave a talk about the original Treifa banquet, and Alex called the event Treifa Banquet 2.0 in a tongue-in-cheek reference. And then the reaction to the Treifa Banquet 2.0 really paralleled the reaction to the original Treifa Banquet in a really neat historical turn of events.
I'm sure it felt neat at the time, too.
It felt great, let me tell you. I got my first hate mail. Because the misinterpretation then as now was both about the reasons that the food was being served and a reaction to an idea of what Jews do in public as opposed to what they do in private. So a lot of the anger that I saw about the Treifa Banquet, the Treifa Banquet 2.0, was an idea that it was a public event and that it was flaunting Jews eating non-kosher food. It was, of course, actually a private invite-only group who are food professionals in the Bay Area. Alex has very kindly let me into the group as a scholar who studies Jews and food. But it was a networking event to which members were allowed to bring guests. It wasn't a public event.
But I guess my question is if it had been a public event, so what? You know, like, in other words, like if people had a big public event where they were like not worshiping God, you know, I think everybody would be okay with it. But somehow to like, why shouldn't people say proudly, you know, I'm a Jew who doesn't believe in keeping kosher, and I'm trying to create a way to be Jewish where we don't keep kosher. And if you do keep kosher, you don't have to come. But like, why the reaction being so strong?
Yeah, because one of the major ways that Jews define their communities is through food and food boundaries. And this is still seen as a taboo that one doesn't cross, or at least in some Jewish circles. I've lived in small Jewish communities where it wasn't a big deal for Jews to order sandwiches from Subway that were not vegetarian, and might have had pork in them for a synagogue dinner. And I've lived in communities where Jews would never think about such a thing.
I want to bring up sort of what I think has been lurking beneath the surface as a theme of this conversation, which is sort of the what is religion, what is culture question. It feels like a biggie that I'd love to get to before we go, because going back to the idea of like dismissive tone, oh, you're a bagels and lox Jew. There's also like, oh, you're a Seinfeld Jew. Oh, you're Jew. And what I've been thinking about for myself recently is actually like, I'm kind of owning that. Like, I grew up and I think I was and am a cultural Jew. And what's funny is I wear a kippah every day and I'm in rabbinical school and I like do lots of religious holidays and I like have a relationship with very ancient texts and all of this stuff. But like when I read your work about food and when I read others' work about pop culture, I feel like my inners, my sacred insides emoting. Like it's not somehow less because it's like culture. It is like a deep part of me. And I think that Jews have been taught to dismiss that part of us. That, oh, the thing we feel when we watch the Rugrats Hanukkah episode is somehow not a legitimate religious impulse in the way that like lighting the candles on Hanukkah is a religious impulse. I will tell you, the former, I think, was a bigger presence in my psyche and my personal growth over time than the latter was. So I guess I wanted to hear from you more on like, when we do this segmenting work between like what is religion on the one hand, what is culture, and we sort of place food generally in the culture box, like what's happening? Why are we doing that? And maybe how could we rethink that?
I know you had Samira Mehta on recently, who does really wonderful work thinking about the relationship between religion and culture. And I've learned a lot from her in this regard. But religious studies scholars, especially scholars of American religious history like me and like Samira Mehta, don't think about religion and culture as separate things. Religion has a culture. Judaism has a culture. And perhaps it's, I happen to like the word religion. For me, as a religious studies scholar, religion really is meaning. I'm a religious studies scholar because I think there's really nothing more interesting I could be doing with my life than studying what is meaningful to people. And I think you guys do that on this podcast, study what is meaningful to Jews. You can be a religious Jew in a traditional sense, one who pays synagogue dues, may or may not go to synagogue, even gives donations to Federation, and still goes for a bagel brunch on Sunday. When I talk about Jews who are nostalgic, in no way is that necessarily talking about Jews who aren't connected to mainstream institutions. You can be a bagels and lox Jew, and you can be any of those other things, or you can be none of those other things. But we can think about these material culture relationships with Judaism. We can think about these popular culture relationships with Judaism and these food relationships with Judaism as another angle.
Can we talk about the distinction between culture, or I don't know exactly what the right academic term is, but the sort of a culture that people see as more serious versus pop culture? Because I think there's also sort of a dismissive attitude towards pop culture. But I mean, maybe there's a way that we can make a distinction between certain kinds of culture that are more about kind of fun and enjoyment and maybe even nostalgia, but that people see as kind of thin, and it's like, it's nice. It's a nice part of your life. It's like, we love going on vacation, but the core of our life is when we're not on vacation. I mean, arguably. And so culture, there's this culture that's like serious, and there's culture that's not serious. And to take Lex's example, on the one hand, Rugrats Hanukkah show, and on the other hand, not necessarily the traditional lighting of the Hanukkah candles, but something that would be playing with that, right? Something that would be really about what our family does when we gather around and we really are kind of experiencing, in this case, a holiday at this really deep level, at a level where we're really getting these deep experiences of meaning, etc. So on the one hand, I think pop culture is more important than people think it is. On the other hand, I don't think everything is all the same. And I'd love for you to kind of talk about that and help walk us through that a little bit.
Absolutely. Pop culture is, of course, extremely important. It's extremely important as a reflection of what we're thinking about. And it's important as something that shapes how we think about the world. Rugrats Hanukkah, which was extremely important in my childhood.
Nice.
Rugrats Hanukkah shaped the way that I thought about Hanukkah, but it also helped me understand the role of Jews in the world. In some ways, it points to the outside role of Jews in media and pop culture, which is a discussion, I think, for another time. Pop culture helps us articulate who we are to ourselves and to others. Rugrats Hanukkah articulates that Hanukkah is part of American culture, which was a really important part of what Samira Mehta talks about as a growing multiculturalism. But Rugrats Hanukkah is really interesting, actually, as somebody who teaches college now. At SF State, my students are a wide variety of ages, as they are at many colleges throughout the United States. But my students who are traditional age students, for them, Rugrats Hanukkah is a kind of classic Now it's not new. And when they think about it, they're analyzing it as a historical piece that helps us think about the American Jewish community in a kind of dated way.
But it just feels to me like, while on the one hand recognizing the importance of something like Rugrats or Seinfeld or whatever we want to talk about at today, Marvelous Mrs. Maisel or Transparent, as significant Jewish cultural experiences of our time, yet they don't. I guess maybe in some way I contrast that with something like Leonard Cohen's music, which maybe is trying to make a claim, or potentially, or people have made the claim for it, that it could actually be integrated into sort of a deep Jewish spirituality in a way that I don't think people sort of imagine that they're going to do with Rugrats, as important as it might be. I guess I'm asking you whether there's a distinction between, let's say, high culture and pop culture that is worth maintaining, or you don't think so?
No. Down with boundaries. Absolutely. I don't understand why those distinctions are useful. Let's look at how these things are meaningful to people. That's what I do as a scholar. And Rugrats Hanukkah can be really meaningful to people. It shapes Jews' views of the world. It shapes non-Jews' views of Jews. I don't know what could be more important than that, honestly.
So we are arcing to the close, and I want to get big picture for a second. I guess this is going to be a mixture of big picture and little picture. We're Judaism Unbound, and we're always thinking about what it means to, unbound Judaism, to create shifts to Judaism as we know it, both incorporating elements of Judaism's past and creating entirely, new kinds of Judaism moving forward. And so because you come with this vast knowledge as a religious historian, as a Jewish historian, I was curious to hear from you whatever advice you might have for us as we take on that effort. And this is the small picture. This is maybe a weird gear shift, but I think it might be related. I was curious to hear from you because I know you've done a lot of work looking at the organization PJ Library. You alluded to them earlier. I was curious if you think that there's something to learn from them on this front in terms of how we go about major shifts to Judaism in the future, what we can learn from an organization like that. But just in general, how would you say, if we're going to go about unbounding Judaism, we would be most likely to achieve the successes that we're looking to achieve?
From a religious history perspective, one of the best ways to make change is to tell people that you aren't making changes, right? We see this with the invention of Sunday school in the 19th century. The invention of Sunday school as a kind of separate institution was a radical idea by women, but they kind of told rabbis that they were still nominally in charge. Don't worry, we're not doing anything shocking. This is just like traditional Jewish education. Of course, it wasn't. It was something really radical. Religious changes tend to happen when they don't look like changes. Something like PJ Library, I think, is radically changing what American Jewish communities look like. They're going into families' homes at their most tender and intimate moments. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, but they're shaping American Jewish families, and they're doing so very consciously.
Thank you so much, Rachel Gross, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been truly a pleasure.
And thanks, of course, to all of you out there listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we hope that you'll tune into many more in the future. Before I call out all the different ways that you can be in touch with us, I wanted to do one more thing. I want to specifically shout out to our zine that is coming out soon for Shavuot. We've got a Shavuot Unbound zine that our incredible Judaism Unbound fellow, in partnership with New Voices, our Judaism Unbound New Voices magazine fellow, Rena Yehuda Newman, has put together an amazing zine that is going to be coming out shortly before Shavuot so that you can use it on Shavuot. It's an action-packed, comic-packed, little incredible comics that Rina Yehuda has done as well are part of it. But it's an action-packed, learning-packed, incredible document that we really hope that you'll utilize in your Shavuot experiences this year, whatever they look like. And you can, of course, play with it, alter it, add to it, subtract from it, the same things we always ask of you whenever you're utilizing Judaism Unbound resources. Play with it to your heart's content. But we wanted to shout that out because it's a really special document that we think can be valuable this time of year and in future years. So that is a shout out. Now to do the part where we do call for you to be in touch with us, because it means a lot to us when our listeners reach out. So the first way is that you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can go to our Twitter feed at Judaism Unbound. Third, you can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And last but not least, you can always hit us up via email at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. The last plug we like to make is that we really deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation that you're able to send our way. And you can do that on either a one-time basis or a monthly recurring gift basis. So you can do that at JudaismUnbound.com/donate. So thanks so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.